It's Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
Bill Saylor on the board today for once in a great while.
Yes.
Thanks for tuning in. This is your weekly, or Dave's weekly discussion of things environmental.
Farmers market, flowers, rather enjoy. Tomatoes farm, and I enjoy going to the farmers market.
They perked up since I saw you at the market.
Yes. Well, it was a warm day, and flowers are hard to distribute, but then if you cut the bottoms off them a little bit and let the cameo and falsam and the parts of the flower get water, they revive. And I grew up with these sorts of flowers.
I want to mention briefly before you get rolling that today is the College of Veterinary Medicine open house.
Oh, yes.
South Lincoln Avenue.
Say a little bit about it.
Well, there's not much to say. It's the College of Veterinary Medicine open house.
Yes.
And they have it every year. It's for the public as well as prospective students, whether they be in high school or 4 years old. And they show a little bit of everything they do. Most of the buildings are opened up. The students mostly run this operation, the vet med students. You can see everything from clinical labs to the wildlife medical clinic, resident birds of prey, and
yes,
lots of different things.
And some of it is animal science sort of research, but it flows over into human research. So you have people that are working with both fields. It's called zoonosis often, where you have problems with animals transmitting disease. So yes, if you just want to go and talk to the people on various spots, you find that you get an education. It's a little bit like agronomy day, where you get to be in a trailer and listen to a general speak, but afterwards you can roll up to the person and ask questions, and that's good.
Yeah, you'll be able to see cows and horses and usually service dogs.
There's invariably a cow that has a viewing device. So
that's okay.
Look in. See, cows have a different sort of stomach system, and they have a rumen. And it's
a nice day today, October 1st, 2017. Nice day, light breeze, sunny.
And there's a little prairie right outside the veterinary school, and that goes back a long way.
For that matter, you could go across the street, Lincoln Avenue, and see the arboretum and the gardens.
Yes, yes, it's a fun place to be. There's the part of the vet school is on a mound, which is part of glaciation, and so you can enjoy that too. A little bit of it has been carved away for a sports field, but it's still there. When you're in a flatland with a little rise, you cut the rise down. I've seen it happen many times. So I wanted to say something about Hugh Hefner. He passed this week. He was a U of I grad, a very independent soul. His grandparents grew up in Nebraska from an immigrant family. She was from a Swiss family. He was from a German family. They moved to the west side of Chicago, and Hugh was born there in 1926. Rather independent child with a good deal of intelligence, and he would sketch at the age of 4. At the age of 8, he had a little newspaper that he distributed up and down the street for a penny per copy. And by the time he was 13, he was starting to think about what was religion, and he was starting to question some very formal background. His parents had grown up in the era of depression, and that had put a a fair constraint on what you could and couldn't do in that era, and many people were working with WPA and other organizations that gave people work and some bread on their table. He went to high school. It wasn't exactly a straight trip. He did a lot of sketching as he was listening to his teachers, and perhaps even not listening to his teachers. It might have been a little bored. But he was, that was a bother. But he was a class leader, a humorist. He continued his cartooning work. Sort of had almost decided by that time that he was a journalist. He went to college and did journalistic things. He took on flying planes. He had a qualification as a pilot on light planes, and just was a gregarious soul. He met at high school his childhood sweetheart, Millie, and married her after graduation. They were virgins at that time, which was sort of part of the growing up after World War II, when things were relatively formal. You had a population of women coming back into family life after they'd had the freedom to work with World War period freedom and jobs that were more than just school teacher or clerical or nurse or things like that. The families were fairly formal, a little on the evangelical side, and not very sexual. Sexuality that was approved was mainly for procreation and not so much for fun. And Hugh got involved in trying to put together a magazine that he would like to do. He wasn't quite sure what he wanted to do, but he was sure that he wanted to publish. So he they got married, and then he was employed with various publishers, where he started to learn the trade, and eventually decided to publish Playboy, which got him quite a bit of criticism as well as some ovations. So he had to be, by that time, a reasonably good visionary business person, and he had to be fairly structured. And I deal with Hef because I think he gives you the opportunity to think that you can do things. It's pretty tough if you're going to be directed in your aims, but you can eventually get there. And he did publish in 1953 Playboy. He had a little trouble before that because he had a different title, and it was challenged legally, so he had to deal with legality. He had to decide whether he wanted to include sexuality as a part of his philosophy. He had a philosophy, but he also wanted to say that sexuality could be fun as well as being intellectual, and so he included that balance. It was something that was sort of needed at the time. The McCarthy era had come to be, and you were very careful what you said and did, lest you lose your place in life. So he overcame quite a few things, and eventually became the Playboy magazine became very popular around the world. He has a reputation for being one of the most advantageous publishers worldwide. Coming from nothing, he started off with a card table and $600 in the kitchen and or a dining room. They had a daughter, and she heads up the Playboy organization. They donate a lot of money to organizations. Then they try not to be too political, but they discuss issues, and the magazine has survived. I'm just reading some of my notes here, because I've taken some of my reading from a book called Hefner by a guy named Frank Brady, and it discusses some of the staffing of this sort of publication. You have to know a lot of people. You have to know people who are graphics and design people that can really make things work. You have to have lawyers. You have to have managers. You need people who are literary people. You need to have freedom to use literary material that may be copyrighted. So after a while it gets to be an organization, and then they had like a castle in north side Chicago, and they'd have huge parties, and there was the criticism that this was a little bit on the orgy side, but and it was and was not in various ways. So it's been very hard for most authors to define who and what Hefner was. He gets a lot of criticism for liberating males in respect of females. But on the other hand, he has been a part of female liberation too. You're sort of suggesting that in an era when we don't want to have huge populations, then sexuality gets to be a fun part of life, and it's also an intellectual part of life. It's just not sexuality alone. And my father was the 14th child, so you can know that if you have 14 children, you can. I just recently looked at an obituary that where someone who was nearing 100 or so had at least the best part of 90 living relatives, and that's an overstocking of the world we have. It's a very small world, and we need to know that you can do things with each other as people, as male and female people, in a very interesting and exciting way. And Playboy, to some extent, was in that realm, despite the fact it was also getting criticism for more porno sort of things. The attempt was to stay away from porno sort of things. It was more a liberation of both males and females. So whatever you think, Hugh Hefner was a nabob of independence. He found that he could get hold of a calendar picture of Marilyn Monroe and put that on the front page and in the centerfold. And that was the first magazine. They weren't sure whether there would be a second one. They didn't put a date on the first magazine because it might not sell, and they would like to go over to another month. The distribution people had to be involved. The outcome was this was a rather popular magazine, so they had to then think about doing a second and a third copy and getting ready for that. Hefner has become very wealthy, but not necessarily the J. Paul Getty type wealth, not wealth for its own sake, but wealth for interesting living and working with people around the globe. So we say farewell to Hugh. He found out that he could get a gravesite next to Marilyn, and since he had been so dependent on Marilyn, he will be buried next door to Marilyn. And so think about people like this that do independent things, and you might fall into that category. Not everyone likes to be sitting in a classroom being taught didactically. Rather, they're people who learn by doing, and a lot of Hefner's career was learning by doing, and I think in the process he taught a lot of others. So that's enough about Hugh at the moment. I wanted to do a little bit about a rather interesting seminar that I went to. It was a visit to solar panels on South Windsor Road. Bill is near me there. His office is just a little bit further away, and it's a huge, I think it's 6.3 acres or something like that, of solar panels. And so the seminar dealt with solar panels and sustainability generally. This attempt is only going to bring up about 2% of the electricity used by the university, but so they don't have to worry about grids and things like that, whereas other organizations have to worry about grids, because on a sunny day you can produce electricity and a dumb day you can't. So the grid has to provide electricity, or you have to send electricity somewhere else when you have too much. That's not the case. What's happening here has connotations for other places. You have to know that in undeveloped countries, there are a lot of technologies that haven't happened. For instance, you don't have a good network of telephones. So instead of going through the era of landlines, many developing countries have gone straight to cell phones, and they are used in a relatively sophisticated manner. Likewise, you're going to producing electricity in a solar manner without having had to go through the era of producing energy from coal or whatever else, oil. So we're in a different era, and I found that the person who was doing this was very clear on explaining it. I'm interested because it's right across the road from a prairie, and one of the first things, we went on a field trip afterwards. You go down First Street and you can go into the agronomy farm there, and you can see this, what used to be the Cruz family farm, and there were a barn and house. The house got burned down formally by the fire department for exercise, and the barn still remained for a long time, and I think Packer moved out. So there's a projection up along the railroad line, which is a little less than square. It would have been nice to have been able to climb up a viewing device and look down on these panels from above. That hasn't happened yet. The official people put a small drone out there and take photographs of it. But my comment was that you need one of these 4 or 3-legged stanchions that you cut the top off. They used to be used for radio aerials. These days, radio aerials pinpoint with guy wires that go out. Not very good for birds, but that's okay. We know about that. But if you take one of those old type radio towers, and you go to the second level and the third level, you can put a stairwell up and people can climb up and look down. Probably not everyone has a drone in their pocket that they can go visit. On the north side of this, there's a nice little prairie. It's a sort of a native prairie. It's been there for years. It's not got a lot of native stuff on it, but it was a little rambunctious. And bless me, I headed straight to see whether that was there, and it's been mown. We have a penchant for anything that we respect has to be mown around in a statement, but so I was looking at that. I was interested. There were a lot of Asian people that were there, and they were enjoying learning about the procedures. The company that brought the solar panels in had it all set up so that they could almost put in a panel 3 feet long or whatever in a minute, more or less. It was highly organized, and there are a few problems. One of them is weeds. What do you do with weeds when they grow up? And so do you herbicide them, or do you cut them out? Or how do you deal with weeds? There's a nice little stream as a tributary to the Umbra that runs very close. Do you herbicide and let the herbicide go down to the Umbra River and into the Wabash and into the Ohio and into the Mississippi and into the kill zone in the Gulf of Mexico? So there's some questions there. It probably also you have to know whether do you turn the panels so that they face the sun. If the season changes and the sunlight's coming in, how do you change? And I think they've opted not to have that sort of facility. It costs a lot more, but that does allow you to organize your sun so it comes and hits the panels more directly. You also need to have people who can service these things. There's a little bit of caution because they do produce electricity, and so it has to be channeled into the university in rather inch-sized cables, and so there's some maintenance that's needed. There's an organization that's needed. At the moment, I think the people who are putting it up are in charge, but in the long run, this will become a university facility, and the university will be in charge. That means you have to have people who can handle that sort of electricity. There are some other types of solar energy that are used, and so I was tempted to ask about hot water. Some homes produce hot water. They have tubes that are heated up, and then they go into the. You can have them. The hot water go in during the day into an underground reservoir, and then at night when you need the heat, or in wintertime when you need the heat, you can pull that hot water up, and so that can be run on the roofs of quite a few buildings. So yes, the university does have that sort of arrangement for heating too. So I thought that was rather helpful. I don't know, Bill, you're close to it. Do you have any comment?
No, I don't. I was going to ask you if they told you how many individual panels they have set up out there.
Oh, I don't know that I could. I have a paper here.
A few hundred probably, or more.
System size. Oh, that's the kilowatts.
Because I was thinking of if you could have a frame where you manually, maybe just twice a year, adjust the angle. And if that might be a intermediate cost rather than a substantial leap in cost to have it track the angle of the sun throughout the year.
Well,
but anyway,
you have to know that we have people locally who do this work, and we had them on this program.
They talk about drainage at all? So when it eventually rains again, it's going to rain on these hard surfaces and run off just like a roof.
I think that, yes, I think that's okay.
And then
It'll run into the umbrella.
Not really vegetation underneath anymore because there's a roof.
The vegetation manages to have lots of sunlight, so
yeah, I'm sure it's gotten weedy.
It's not that shaded that it will shade out the weeds, so you have to do something with the weeds, and that has not always been a problem for people. If you're in the desert, you don't have that problem.
Yeah.
But if you're in the Midwest with good prairie soils, you're going to have weeds.
Maybe overtake the panels.
Yes.
That would be a problem.
So mowing is probably the answer, but it's not the answer if you're outside the area of the panels, where you could have a nice little piece of prairie. We have a problem with people haven't seen a prairie for 6 generations, and we need to save those little pieces. That's a whole nother event. That means going to park districts and cities and encouraging little prairies like our Parker Prairie across the way. It's endangered because how many restaurant tables could you put in that prairie? So also cultivars, or plants that have been cultivated and bred, always produce a lot of flowers like the ones we have here. They're bigger and better than the native plants, flowering for a short time with small flowers, and a lot of green, and then over the winter there's a lot of tan and weedy-looking material, whereas you could go into the winter with pansies that can handle cold weather. But the prairie would have something like New England aster, which would go right into November or December. There has to be an understanding of what to mow, when to mow it, and how to mow it. At the moment, we have a mowing regime that starts in August the 1st, when most of the prairie has not seeded yet. So if you're going to deal with roadside development, you need to think about what you do with mowing and how you can destroy a prairie by mowing. And the state is into that some. They have a new committee set up that is prepared to look at roadside management. But roadside management can also include pollination sorts of things. Cultivars are quite good pollinators, so sometimes roadside projects include cultivated plants. And one of the ones that we really is a menace for us is sweet clover. It flowers well, it's a good pollinator, but wow, it's a really aggressive weed, and we don't need that. So these committees that are working at the state level and often at the national level too, to encourage pollination, can sometimes be very different from a prairie preservation group, which is trying to preserve the genetic gene pool.
You're tuned to the Prairie Monk program on WEFT Champaign, 90.1 FM. It's a little past half past the hour here on October 1st, 2017.
So I've been pleased to receive quite a few accolades for the trail between Urbana and St. Joe. I would encourage you to get out there and use it. You can walk. You've got to be careful if you walk, because some of these bicycle people can go 30 miles an hour. and not always are we used to shouting out on your right or
Left.
whatever. So there's a safety problem.
On your
So
left.
I've had some people who have some reserve about walking. Just be careful. Take a good pair of shoes or boots, because this is crushed limestone, and if you lift it up, it will sometimes get inside your boot, and that can be annoying. But otherwise, it's a rather straight passageway to St. Joe, and it's being well used. And if that happens, then we will have much better chance of finishing this 25 miles to Danville, and also working on the 33 miles we have in the Monticello area. At that area, the railroaders are putting in we have a new organization called the Champaign, Havana, and Western Railroad. That was what the original railroad which went out to Monticello was labeled. And so railroad engineers are re-railing 4 miles of our rail between Whiteheath and Seymour. And I'm tempted to think that we could do something interesting there if we are lucky enough to retain the railroad that is already intact between Seymour and Bonneville and Champaign. Then we'll have access for historic trains, including steam engines if necessary. At the moment, we have to replace one bridge because the federal government mandates that if you abandon a railroad, you take out the bridges for liability reasons, so no one will commit suicide often. So we bought 33 miles of railroad bed with the bridges intact at the appropriate time when we could save the bridges. So we have 3 truss bridges and 27 trestles that otherwise would have been removed. But we did get one piece of ground between Whiteheath and Seymour before or after the railroad bridge has been removed. So we have to find a railroad bridge and move it to that location. I'm not quite sure how to do that because sometimes the bridges that we're talking about are bigger than any semi-trailer that you would want to use. So the thing that I'm thinking about, I ran into a Canadian National employee who is aware that we may lose this piece between Seymour and Bonneville and Staley and Champaign. There's still quite a lot of business that goes out. Kraft Humco has rail movement of product. There's gravel that's brought in from Kankakee, and there's plastic that comes in. 4 cartloads of plastic by railroad is equivalent to 13 semi-trailers with the same amount of material. So the railroad is not only cheaper, but it saves the impact of 13 trailers on the roads. And it's also safer because some of those semi-trailers, especially in winter, have a whole bunch of ice on top of them, and that gets to be dangerous. There are crossings and accidents that roads have that railroads do not have, or do not have to some extent. So we're looking at that, but I was talking to this Canadian National person, and one of his avocations is to go west to a railroad where they have go-karts. And when you maintain a railroad, you have, early on, you have cranes that can tow a little trailer that has 33-foot long railroad steel, and so the crane can move around backwards, take a piece of railroad and move it up and make the next piece of rail that they're going to work on. So you have these little cranes, but you also have trikes that are used by workers to get to and from the advanced edge of a railroad being built. Sometimes they're one-person trikes, sometimes they're four-person trikes. If you happen to be going downhill, you might just be moving at 30 miles an hour. They can be kind of outrageous. So, but he enjoys going west to where there's a railroad, and I'm thinking that this, if we get this railroad organized, it could be a 4-mile spot where you could run trikes and enjoy it. These days those trikes are mechanized, but in the past it was human power that ran these trikes, and they were there to make sure that the railroad was in good condition. If you look at some of the older railroads, you can see them bend. If you're looking at the main line, the railroads are uniform and straight, and there's no bends unless they're official bends. And you have maintenance by pieces of equipment that are laser beamed and can be very, very accurate. You have to know that if you have a train and it's moving at a certain centrifugal force, then one track has to be a little bit higher than the other. But if you make it a little too high, then the train can fall over. If you make it a little too low, then the train kind of screeches it around the bend. So you have to have people who are good at doing that. We're kind of volunteer railroad engineers included, and families that have been involved with the Railroad Museum, and these are people who know the industry. And on either side of that railroad bed will be the prairie that we basically bought the prairie for, the corridor for in the first place. It may take us a long time to do that, but it may be that we might be able to encourage, and I've been dreaming, I'd like to suggest that perhaps we get concrete people who are specialists, who work with ceramic engineers, who add to the concrete silicon and aluminum that they harvest from smokestacks. And when they add this to the concrete, they can make a relatively flexible concrete, so that as a railroad train moves over the tie, it can move a little bit if necessary, but the soil underneath always is likely to move a little bit. And in wet weather, it'll get softer. So ties last longer if they're stable, but they also last longer if they move a little bit. That's why wooden ties are pretty good, because they can move a little bit. So I'm thinking of a proposal where we bring these people together, and perhaps you need something like 2,000 ties per mile. And if you can establish a research unit, and I have evil intent, to see if we can't guarantee to produce perhaps an experimental group of 2,000 concrete ties, with the intent that this might be a multiplier effect for other railroads or other places. We don't have the trees to produce 2,000 ties per mile, and besides, concrete ties are an improvement. Humans sometimes do improve on nature, and so this is what we are sort of dreaming about. And it all involves getting together volunteers who would like to put in ties. The intent is at the moment to put in a tie and then a miss tie and then do another tie and miss a tie, so that you can put in ties afterwards. So you make the track, you make the wagons that go on the track, or the historic trains that are on the track, are often lighter weight, especially the carriages. The heavier piece of equipment is a steam engine with a huge power wheel, and that load is on one location. So there's where you need the traditional tie with 9 inches between it or what have you, and fairly responsible rails that you have to imagine if the rails aren't responsible, the rails can move apart and the engines are going to be sitting on their bed. So you have to do something to make sure that those rails are good. That means that you have to have ties from the concrete to the rail, and you have to have a plate underneath the rail, and you have to have spikes. Well, if you create a spike that is not a spike, it makes a connection with the rail, then that's a sort of research thing that the railroad engineers are into to improve railroading. So we're hoping that we might be able to encourage some sort of research plus applied help that would be possible just 8 miles out of town, or it might be a little further than that. But usually the rails have been 33 feet long so that you can handle them, and they're labelled by their weight. So an interurban tram can run on 60 pound per yard, whereas a main line that's running outside of Champaign is usually running on about 135 pound per yard, and is much more heavy duty. As the railroads are thinking of going more than a 100-ton hopper car, then you need that sort of weight. But we're dealing with historic trains, and you've gone into an era after the 40s. The steam engines lost out; their efficiency is not great. The Railroad Museum has a functional engine, but it only uses it once a month because it is really quite costly to put. They changed it from coal to oil, but in one day of utilization, it can use a lot of oil. So we've morphed into an era, starting in the late 40s, of diesel motors. And diesel motors have bogies that can be a set of two wheels together or 3 wheels together. And what they do compared with the steam engine is they don't have the weight in one small place. It's spread, and you can have 2 engines in a row. Some of the trains that are going down past Champaign, I sort of was at a stop last night when I was counting. I got up to 90 cars before, and I was only still at about 2/3 of the train. So they're long and they're heavy. So we would like to encourage the railroads. We'd like to encourage the prairies on either side, and we'd like to encourage the history of bringing a railroad train into Champaign. So at the outset, it might have to be a 1 or 2 engines with bogies that spread the weight. And then as a child, you'll get used to knowing what the number of the engine is, what its pistons are like, and if you're graduating from college, you might just have someone pay $100 for you to drive that train for an experimental piece. We would like the train to go down to Shady Rest and deliver people to Shady Rest so they could have a shiitake where you would have some tents and what was an old picnic ground. And this was in an era of horses where you could only go about 15 miles with a horse out of town. So there was this picnic ground on the Sangamon River, and it's there, and you can tell it's been a picnic ground because there's big trees and little trees and no in-between trees. So the picnic ground had open trees and a flat. You could have flat races. You probably had a deer or a bear or some other creatures. And people would come with their horse and cart and get together just the same way as you can come with a group of RVs and put them together in a corral and watch your television or whatever you want to do. But so we have that opportunity of taking a train down 1 mile, down to Shady Rest and perhaps delivering you. In the day, you would pay 5 cents to get to the train to the Shady Rest picnic ground. There were flat concrete places with a little cabin on each, and you could rent a cabin. You could go fishing in the Sangamon River. You could walk, and there are tributaries coming in there. There's Madden Creek, and Madden Creek, there's not only a truss bridge and a long trestle, but you go across Shady Rest Road, and then you go across another bridge, and you go up to Lodge. And at Lodge, you could even take a train onto, this is if you had the opportunity to do it. It's probably too costly to do, so it may not ever happen. But you could take the train onto the main line. That's if you have permission, and that's if you have a pilot, and that's if you have a restaurant car, and you're taking people on a 23-mile trip, which would go up to Lodge and down to Monticello, and back to Nelson's Crossing, which is the headquarters of the Railroad Museum. In there, are some modern things. Just recently, they've had I think this has yet to come, a bicycle race. There was a dentist and a couple of others that used to run a bicycle race in the Monticello area. But we have to think about taking a bicycle from Champaign to Monticello. At one stage, I had thought that it was quite possible to put chip limestone down on the railroad and ride the bicycle along the railroad line when there was no train there. This is possible if you're in downtown Chicago. The trains are waddling through the streets, and you can have cars running over the tracks or along the tracks. It's doable, but it's a trauma because on main lines, if people horse around with trains and walk onto a railroad line or drive a car across a railroad line and stall on the line, the engine driver has no capacity at all to stop a 100-car train easily. Even if you have brakes on all the vehicles, you can't stop that easily. So there get to be accidents at crossings. Well, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a simple trail. It's obviated by the fact that you can get to Shady Rest by a Shady Rest Road, so that people don't need to walk down the railroad line. But 100 years ago, people walked down the railroad line. Perhaps sometimes they might have been hurt, but usually trains were aware of this. Trains would actually stop and pick you up. The interurbans would do that. And it's an interesting place. So we're encouraging the efforts of the Champaign, Havana, and Western Historic Railroad, which is beginning to re-rail. And we would like some of you to be out there helping to put in railroad ties. There's a little skill to doing that. You have to put down the ties. You have to put down the plates on top of the ties. In this case, we don't have the luxury of concrete ties, but the wooden ties are there, and the railroad engineers have been going over to ADM in Decatur to pick up second-hand railroad ties. Decatur has huge yards, and every so often they restore the railroad beds so that they won't have derailments. Some of these wagons take 100 tons, and they're heavy. So they have to have good rails and good ties underneath the rails, and they have to have good ballast underneath that. So maintenance is important. So when they reject railroad ties, it's not always impossible to use it again in a more lightweight situation. So they've been collecting ties. You got to be very careful to put them down and then put some rail on top of them, because railroad ties are like ice cream. If you put them down for 5 minutes, they will disappear. And so you have to put them in, and they're making them a little further apart than usual so they can get some action. And in the long run, you can poke a tie in under the railroad bed. You can actually have a little crane that lifts the rail up a little bit and allows you to push the tie in. And then you have people with hammers, and they're called gandy dancers. And the gandy dancers will have songs, and you can pound the gravel into under the tie and firm it up. And you can have railroad workers who also have songs. You have a foreman that knows how to sing, and by the time you put the rail in, you want to move it by 1/8 of an inch. So you have tongs, and everyone moves in the sound, and when a certain sound happens, you move the rail just a little and stabilize it. So that happened a lot when we were putting in railroads in the past, and now we can do the same sort of thing if we want. We probably don't have the songs, and we don't have the foreman to sing it, but we have the opportunity for some of you to help put in these tracks. And so the engineers have been looking to independent volunteer, Illini volunteer action, and we get volunteers that are helping. We have to be organized ourselves enough to be able to get you out there and explain what you want to do, and have you work in a situation that is fairly physical. And you need boots and jeans and gloves, and some of you don't have physical experience, so your hands get blisters if you're not careful. So just if you volunteer, be aware that you might be only able to give a half hour, but that will be enough that you'd be surprised what you can do in a half an hour. It might be removing vegetation so we can actually work on the bed at the time. You need surveyors to survey the line. We need to work with Parkland College to have a survey team, and there are people who have to do nuts and bolts together, and use a sledgehammer occasionally, and know a little bit about what's going on, and that is interesting. I encourage people to have curiosity about all sorts of things, and one of them is about railroad beds and how railroads move and shake. And we have a big railroad going through north to south, and you should know about that. And I also like to have people who are who are planners and have them to include the railroads. Sometimes it's thought that railroads are antique, and they're left out of planning pictures, and I like to see that in there. Here we have viaducts under the railroad line, and that defines the railroad a little bit. But in some places, the railroads get left out, or they're very light in the background, but they're really an economically very essential part of our nation. I think we're nearly to the end. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. And listen to us if we can.
You can hear the Prairie Monk every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. here on 90.1 FM locally in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, and on the web at weft.org. Later in the week on Urbana Public Access TV, and eventually on YouTube.